Wrangel Island off the coast of Siberia is one of the harshest places on Earth. Bone-chilling temperatures plummet to minus 50 degrees, gale-force winds howl across the frozen landscape, and there's months of suffocating darkness. In the summer of 1923, a famous explorer sent a group of inexperienced young men and one local Inupiat woman to this unforgiving land. His motivations? Pure greed and the lure of fame. Abandoned and isolated for 2 brutal years, they faced relentless winters, dwindling food supplies, and vanishing wildlife. When the rescue ship finally arrived, they were met with a haunting, shocking sight. In 1913, Vilhjalmur Stephenson organized a major expedition to the Canadian Arctic. It involved 3 large ships, a sizable crew, and funding from the Canadian government. His ambitious goal was to find a continent north of the Canadian archipelago, which is north of the Canadian mainland. It's a region consisting of 94 major islands and over 36,000 smaller islands. The main ship, the Karluk, became marooned in the ice in August of 1913. A crew of 5, led by Stephenson, left the ship to go hunting, and he left the crew under the captain's watch, because he knew that the ship would be carried off by the shifting ice, and that's exactly what happened. The ice eventually crushed the Karluk, leaving 25 people, including 2 Inuit children, stranded on the ice, 97 kilometers or 60 miles north of Wrangel Island. And then the Karluk sank in January of 1914. Famed Newfoundland seaman Bob Bartlett led everyone to Wrangel Island, and conditions were brutal. 2 4-man parties who went separate ways were lost and never seen again. The Arctic's brutal environment tested their endurance as they faced freezing temperatures, dwindling supplies, and the constant threat of the ice beneath them giving way. To save everyone, the captain and his Inuit guide set off from Wrangel Island on March 18th to get help. It was a dangerous trek across the ever-shifting ice to the Russian coastline, and their progress was agonizingly slow. The ice frequently broke apart underneath them, exposing this treacherous open water. The bitter wind whipped at their faces as they spent countless hours digging supplies out from under drifting snow. But on April 4th, their hearts lifted as they reached land. They eventually arrived in Nome, Alaska on May 27th. Meanwhile, back on Wrangel Island, those left behind endured brutal living conditions and gnawing hunger. The cold was relentless, seeping into their bones, and the darkness seemed endless. Despair set in as 2 men died from nephritis, which is inflammation of the kidneys. Another man died from a gunshot wound, shrouding the camp in suspicion and fear. Was it an accident, suicide, or murder? No one knew for sure. In September 1914, the remaining 14 survivors were picked up by an American fishing boat. The expedition was a colossal disaster and damaged Stephenson's reputation. 11 people died in what was called the greatest Arctic disaster since the Franklin expedition. And one survivor later reflected that none of the horrors he witnessed during the war could blot out memories of that year in the Arctic. Stephenson faced harsh criticism, but in his book, The Friendly Arctic, he blamed everyone but himself. He deflected blame, never expressing sorrow for the lost men. Critics felt that he spent too much time selling the idea of the expedition and too little ensuring the quality of the food that people were dependent on. Scurvy, a brutal disease caused by a vitamin C deficiency, plagued the expedition. Fred Moorer is a central figure in this story as we go on, and he was on this early expedition. He recalls suffering from scurvy on this trip. The lack of fresh meat, fruit, and vegetables led to horrifying symptoms. Blood vessels ruptured, blood oozed from hair follicles, and blotches appeared all over the body. Bruises could cause internal bleeding, and limbs swelled painfully. Luckily, he recovered and returned home, but little did he know that this would not be his only struggle to survive on Wrangel Island. Vilhjalmur Stephenson was born William Stephenson in Manitoba in 1879. Seeking to honor his Icelandic roots and gain some credibility in the world of explorers, he changed his name to Vilhjalmur. As an anthropology student at Harvard University, he not only studied but taught there for 2 years. From 1906 to 1912, Stephenson traveled extensively through the uncharted wilderness of the eastern Arctic. Unlike previous explorers, he immersed himself in the customs of the Inuit. He dressed like them, he ate their traditional foods, hunted alongside them, and adopted their methods of travel. When he returned to the south, he enthusiastically praised the Inuit, calling the Arctic the friendly Arctic. He claimed it was a place where a family could live as comfortably as they could in Hawaii, a stark contrast to the common perception of the Arctic as a harsh, uninhabitable wilderness. And remember Fred Moore from the ill-fated expedition? Well, he endured 6 long, harrowing months on Wrangel Island and would have died from scurvy if the rescue ship hadn't arrived. After his return from the Arctic, he was hailed as a hero in his hometown. Fred, the youngest of 10 kids, was soft-spoken, stoic, but calm and cool under pressure. At 18, he left home to pursue his dreams of adventure. He met Stephenson while on Herschel Island, and the charismatic, experienced explorer had a profound impact on Fred. Fred was desperate to head back to the Arctic. The cold, the vast ice, and the stark beauty was all he could think about. His family really struggled to understand his yearning to go back to a place where he almost lost his life. Yet for Fred, the Arctic, it wasn't just a place of danger and hardship. It was where he felt most alive, where the spirit of adventure called to him louder than anywhere else. When Stephenson left the Karluk back in 1913, he and his small group ventured even deeper into the Arctic. They embarked on a grueling 3-month sled journey across the ice of the Beaufort Sea to Banks Island. Over the next 3 years, they established winter bases in numerous areas. They explored unknown territories and discovered new islands. An explorer's dream. Stephenson aimed to prove that an expedition could live off the resources of the land and sea for long periods of time. His success was largely due, though, to the tireless work of the Inuit hunters and seamstresses that he hired. Despite Stephenson saying how self-sufficient they were, his party often faced hunger and deteriorating health. The cold and relentless winds tested their endurance daily. The government, they were concerned about the expedition's welfare, so they ordered Stephenson to return, but he refused and just stayed in the Arctic even longer. In 1915, his group reached Cape Kellett in the eastern Arctic and came across a ship that was anchored nearby. The men on the ship spotted people walking on the beach and they assumed they were local Inuit because it was an uninhabited area. To their astonishment, it was Stephenson and his group who had been living off the land for 2 years. Among those on the ship was Lorne, a young, impressionable man that was enthralled by Stephenson's tales. Lorne, at 22 years old, was outgoing, carefree. He told people that he was born with adventure in him. He was immediately struck by Stephenson's appearance, noting that he didn't look like anyone who had just spent 2 years in the harsh wilderness. And in that moment, Lorne resolved to conquer the North for himself. He spent the next 4 years learning Arctic survival from Stephenson. And wouldn't you know it, Stephenson had yet another wild adventure planned. He wanted to spend a whole year drifting on an ice floe. Not most people's idea of fun, but that's an Arctic explorer for you. Lorne went from novice to expert explorer while he was working with Stephenson, and he was so excited to join this expedition. But Stephenson soon fell ill and had to leave, leaving Lorne on the ice floe with a few other people. He ended up spending 6 months on that ice floe, and it was about 11 kilometers or 7 miles long by 24 kilometers or 15 miles wide. They killed a bunch of seals and polar bears and said they had a plentiful supply of meat. During this time, Lorne became a master builder of snow houses and learned the secrets of hunting seals at floe edges, in open water, and even under the ice. They made skin garments and boots and adapted to a meat-only diet. In 1921, after Lorne returned home, he was working as a policeman when Stephenson invited him to join his speaking tour. Lorne jumped at the opportunity and hoped that it was his link to go back to the Arctic. Ada Delatuck was an Inupiat woman born in 1898 in the remote village of Spruce Creek, Alaska. That was the same year as the Klondike Gold Rush. Ada was extremely shy, but she was charming and lighthearted. As a child, Ada grew up listening to her grandmother's stories, including many about the great polar bear. These captivating and terrifying stories haunted Ada, who was obsessed with the idea of being eaten alive and trapped in a polar bear's stomach. At the tender age of 9, Ada took on a responsibility far beyond her years. Her father was very ill, and she set out with her younger sister, desperately trying to get him to Nome, Alaska by dog sled. But he died along the way. Eventually, Ada was taken in by Methodist missionaries in Nome. There she learned to read and write in English and acquired skills in math, cooking, washing, cleaning, and most crucially, sewing. In that environment, sewing warm, waterproof clothing was vital for survival. While Ada did know how to sew, she hadn't really learned the traditional skills of hunting, trapping, or building shelters. When Ada was 16, she married a much older hunter and musher named Blackjack. He treated her horribly, beating and starving her, and eventually abandoning her where they were living about 64 kilometers or 40 miles from Nome. A few years later, they were divorced, and she had 3 children with him, but only one survived, Bennett. Bennett was a frail child, and he suffered from tuberculosis, which is a debilitating lung disease that was one of the leading causes of death at the time. In 1821, Ada and Bennett undertook a grueling journey, walking the entire distance to Nome, Alaska. And Bennett was just 5 years old, and he was often too tired to walk, so Ada lifted him into her arms and carried him. Ada faced a heartbreaking decision in Nome. She couldn't afford to care for Bennett, so she dropped him off at an orphanage where he would be under the care of doctors. It was a painful sacrifice, but she hoped that it would give him the best chance for recovery. Stephenson was on a massive speaking tour traveling all over the U.S. to share his captivating stories of exploration in the friendly Arctic. During this tour, Fred and Lorne met for the first time. Both were 28 years old and began to bond over their shared longing to return to the Arctic. Fred and Lorne frequently discussed their desperate desire to go back north, and they tirelessly tried to convince Stephenson to organize another expedition and include them in the crew. For Fred, the Arctic was an obsession despite his near-death experience on Wrangel Island just 8 years earlier. Back then, amidst the suffering and despair, he had sworn he would never return. But time had softened those memories, and the pain and suffering that had once been so vivid had faded, replaced by the burning desire to return. He wanted to go back not only to prove that he could survive there, but he also wanted to make sense of what happened to his friends who died there. He knew he'd never be able to be happy until he went back. Milton Gall was a 19-year-old from Texas, and he had a magnetic personality that drew people in instantly. His wicked sense of humor and unwavering confidence endeared him to everyone that he met. People adored Milton, and girls developed wild crushes on him. As the oldest of 3 siblings, he'd been raised to think freely, explore, and appreciate life. He grew up believing he could do anything that he set his mind to, and what he wanted most was to go to the Arctic. Milton was doing the opposite of adventure when he was working as a traveling salesman. And then he landed his dream job running the projector on Stephenson's speaking tour. It was an opportunity beyond his wildest dreams, allowing him to be close to the stories and adventures of the Arctic. Fred and Lorne quickly took a liking to Milton, and they admired his zest for life and infectious enthusiasm. They told him that if they ever had a chance to go north again, they wanted him to join. The men didn't know it, but Stephenson was already in talks with the Canadian government about funding another expedition. Stephenson's big goal was to lay claim to Wrangel Island for Canada. The ownership of the island he thought was kind of debatable. Some believed at the time that the Russians had the right to it because they were the first to search for it, though they never found it. Others argued that because the Americans made the first official landing in 1881, the U.S. held claim. And all Stephenson saw from the island was profit and money. He envisioned it as his strategic asset. It could be a future air base, a radio station, a meteorological station, and a profitable hunting ground for walrus. And it had the potential for reindeer breeding. Though Stephenson had largely given up exploring by now and was earning his money through his speaking tours and books, he saw this expedition as an investment in his future. The previous 6-month occupation by his team was the longest by anyone, bolstering his belief that Great Britain through Canada had as much right to the island as anyone. The plan was to send a crew to claim the island, but Stephenson wouldn't be going, and he needed a British or Canadian citizen to officially claim the island. He recruited Fred and Lorne, but he was initially unsure about Milton because he was so young and inexperienced. But he eventually decided to let him join. He told Milton that he couldn't pay him, but Milton would be able to make profit from any of the furs that he brought back. And Milton was totally fine with that. He just wanted to go. And if you haven't figured it out by now, Stephenson was a little bit of a shyster. He deceived Milton by claiming that he had beaten out 10,000 other applicants, including college professors and engineers, who all wanted to be a part of that coveted expedition. So Milton was super excited and grateful and really proud of himself for landing this rare job. But he was the only one who applied. Milton's mother was completely heartbroken that he would be gone for years, but he was ecstatic. The 19-year-old, eager to prove himself, told his mother, "It's about time I leave the apron behind." Now Stephenson needed a Canadian. He sent a letter to the University of Toronto advertising the expedition and requesting someone with experience in botany, zoology, geology, and photography. In came a 20-year-old Alan Crawford, eager and determined. The oldest of three, Alan was close to his family and grew up in Toronto, but he'd never ventured north of the city. Yet he idolized explorers and adventurers. Alan was known for his extreme patience, his even temper, and sense of humor. He was also studying paleontology, chemistry, mineralogy, and geology, which were all a great fit for the expedition. The promise of an Arctic adventure captivated him, and he was desperate to be chosen. He reached out to Stephenson, emphasizing his perfect health, a crucial requirement for the journey. Alan was drawn to the expedition not just for the adventure, but for the opportunity to be an early investor. Stephenson was impressed with Alan's robust scientific education and enthusiasm, and he selected him for the job. Alan, overjoyed, bought shares in Stephenson's company, excited by the potential of significant profit. Meanwhile, Stephenson anxiously awaited support from the Canadian government. They were wary of his reputation, understandably after the previous disastrous expedition, and hesitant to endorse another venture. Time was ticking, and Stephenson was determined to get a ship up to the high Arctic that summer. Impatient and resolute, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He informed the men he may not be able to pay them very much, maybe $150 a month, and to the men it seemed like a generous enough offer. They were just happy to be a part of the expedition. Both Milton and Alan's parents were deeply concerned for their sons. They assumed Stephenson would be accompanying them on the trip, but he had no such plan. Had the parents known this, they would have fought harder to keep their sons home. Alan's mother was especially anxious and asked Stephenson to write her a letter reassuring her of the journey's safety. With a blend of charm and deception, Stephenson responded, describing the Arctic as safe and common a place as Manitoba or Montana. He dismissed the terrors of the North as mere myths, trying to calm her fears. Milton's mother was heartbroken at the prospect of her son leaving for a couple of years. And Fred's family couldn't figure out why he chose to go back to the place where he nearly died. They couldn't understand his relentless pull to the north, a region that caused him so much suffering. Family recognized Lorne's passion for the north and didn't want to stand in the way of his dreams, despite the emotional toll it took on them. As the only Canadian in the group, Alan would be the official commander of the expedition. He was equipped with geological and meteorological instruments and books on collecting and identifying birds and animals to document life on the island. Stephenson was already short on funds, so he borrowed $1,000 from Fred's brother to cover food for the trip. And he wrote to Alan, detailing the supplies that they needed and instructed him to consult with Lorne on what to purchase. Stephenson advised reducing supplies from 6,500 rounds of ammunition to 4,500 and from 5 shotguns to 3. He also told them to buy 2 tons of groceries, but no canned goods or preserves in glass. They were to limit their purchase of bacon and butter, relying instead on seal, and to not buy too much meat because they would be hunting their own game. But Stephenson's main reason for these reductions was just to save money, a decision that would have severe consequences for the crew in the coming months. While on the island, their clothing would be sewn from furs and skins by the local indigenous people. Fred and Lorne, being the only ones with Arctic experience, were left in charge of purchasing everything. Stephenson stressed the importance of bringing a skin boat for hunting off the island. Skin boats, or umiaks, are made of driftwood and covered in seal or walrus skins, and they're usually 25 to 30 feet in length. They're light enough to carry, but strong enough to transport 2 to 3 tons of meat. The men all expected Stephenson to join them on the island after about a year, bringing a larger expedition with him. And Stephenson told them if they couldn't reach the island by ship, they were to spend the winter in Siberia, then cross over to the island by sled in March. He described the trip across the shifting ice pack as a very simple undertaking, despite never having attempted it himself. The men traveled on the ship Victoria from Seattle to Nome, a voyage filled with anticipation and tension. Amongst the tension and chaos of setting off, an unexpected delight brought smiles to the men's faces. On board, there were 3 kittens owned by one of the crew. In a letter to his parents, Alan shared a moment of joy, saying that they were given the prettiest kitten, which they named Vic, after the ship, and they were going to take her to Wrangel Island as a mascot. As they approached Nome, the once vibrant town now felt like a ghost town. They heard Captain Jack Hammer, you heard that right, and his ship the Silver Wave to take them to Wrangel Island. The season was growing late and the urgency to reach Wrangel Island intensified. Meanwhile, the crew tried to find some local Inupiat families to work with them on the island. Ada Blackjack was suggested by the Nome chief of police, and he said that she was an excellent seamstress. He said she didn't have the greatest reputation in Nome, but he thought the trip might do her some good. Ada considered the offer. Even though her son Bennett was in the children's home, he still depended on her daily visits, and it was going to be hard to leave him. She was told that other Inupiat families would be going, which made her feel more comfortable about it. And the pay at $50 a month was more than she had ever seen. But her paralyzing fear of polar bears made her hesitate. Then again, she thought 2 years of pay would be enough to get Bennett out of the orphanage and take him to Seattle for treatment. Torn between fear and necessity, Ada sought counsel from a local shaman. The shaman's prediction was grim. Yes, you will sail to the island, the shaman said. But there's only death and danger ahead for the expedition. Be aware of knives and fire. Terrified by these words, Ada tried to push her fears aside, so she reluctantly agreed to join the expedition. When she met Alan, she was immediately drawn to his kind demeanor. Alan, who had been warned that the locals were sullen, gloomy, and dirty, saw none of those traits in Ada. She was shy but charming, and had a mixture of determination and vulnerability. As they prepared to set sail for Wrangel Island, the tension and excitement among the crew was palpable. The ship creaked and groaned as it was loaded with supplies, and Alan double-checked the instruments that he brought, while Fred and Lorne ensured they had enough ammunition and essential tools. And this is when they were faced with their first challenge. None of the Inupiat families they had hoped to hire showed up. Only Ada Blackjack arrived, standing alone on the dock. The locals thought the risk was far too great and just refused to join the expedition. The men knew they needed more people to help hunt and sew, crucial skills for their survival. They also worried about what their families and outsiders might say. 4 men on an isolated island with a single young woman? So they promised Ada that they'd try to recruit local families in Siberia where they had to stop along the way. And Ada's decision was bolstered by the words of another woman she knew who had worked as a seamstress on one of Stephenson's previous expeditions. She assured Ada that Lorne was a decent man and encouraged her to go. So Ada agreed to the journey. The crew left Nome on September 9, 1921. Alan's feelings as he left Nome were a mix of nervous excitement and confident optimism. He really believed in the success of the expedition, but he was blissfully unaware of what was to come. When they arrived at East Cape, Siberia, the men tried to find an umiak, but they were much too expensive, so they opted to buy a small, cheap one, and they also bought a dory from the captain. The dory was a heavy wooden boat, practically the opposite of what they needed, but they bought it anyways, hoping for the best. Ada waited patiently for some Inupiat families to join, but no one showed up. Like the locals in Alaska, they were just wary of the mission and did not trust the men. But the expedition would move forward regardless, and they sailed towards the island. On September 14th, they first spotted Wrangel Island. The sight of the desolate, icy expanse filled them with a mix of determination and dread. On the trip, they had battled intense storms which rocked the ship violently, testing their resolve. The umiak got blown off the ship, and all they had to rely on now was that big, heavy wooden dory. The relentless Arctic wind howled and icy spray stung their faces, but their goal was finally in sight. The captain was stunned. He couldn't believe they were going to be staying on this island. It was so isolated and harsh, he was just confused as to why they wanted to go there, and they never told him that their plan to lay claim to the island. Wrangel Island is 140 kilometers or 225 miles from mainland Russia. It stretches 120 kilometers or 80 miles long and about 50 kilometers or 30 miles wide. It's a vast expanse of ancient metamorphic rocks, sedimentary rocks, mudstones, siltstones, and dark shales. The island has 2 mountain ranges, with the highest peaks reaching about 1,000 meters or 3,500 feet. The landscape is crisscrossed by 1,400 rivers and streams and around 900 small lakes. The winds are constant and fierce, relentlessly shaping the harsh environment. About 300 to 400 polar bears give birth in snow dens on the island, and it's the world's largest denning site for polar bears. The southern coast has the largest population of Pacific walrus in the world, with about 80,000 to 100,000 individuals. Arctic fox, wolverine, and lemmings also inhabit the island. Among birds, only the snowy owl and raven are year-round residents. They finally landed on Wrangel Island on September 16th. The men immediately raised the British flag, claiming the island for Great Britain. Ada stood quietly, watching the ship pull away, heading back to Alaska. A wave of emotion washed over her, and she moved away from the men to hide her tears. She longed to leave, but her sense of duty and the promise she had made to the men kept her there. Besides, without her, who would sew their essential clothing? Their arrival was met with this unusually calm and gentle breeze. The sun was shining brightly, and there was no ice in sight, which is a rare sight for the island. It was a deceptive welcome to the harsh environment that was to come. They got to work setting up their camp immediately. They put up 3 tents, 1 for living quarters and 2 for supplies. Although the island lacked trees, it had an endless supply of driftwood, which they used to construct the frame of the house against a steep hill. The plan was to cover the remaining 3 sides with snow blocks in October when there was enough snow. The winter would be dangerously cold, and they knew they needed a solid, warm place to retreat. The floor would be made of split logs, while the roof would be covered with sod for extra insulation. They put up 2 tents sewn together inside the house for added warmth. The men would sleep in the larger area, while Ada would sleep in the smaller tent, which doubled as a kitchen. And they had a wood-burning stove to keep warm. The crew quickly settled into a routine, carrying out scientific and exploratory work. They hiked across the island, studied vegetation, animals, minerals, and documented their findings in journals. At the beginning, the men were pleased with Ada. She worked hard, but she was deathly afraid of polar bears. They all got along fine, though, and they gradually got to know each other a bit better. Lorne would invent silly poems at night. Alan liked to tell bad jokes. Ada enjoyed singing hymns, and Milton could always be found typing away on his typewriter. They saw plenty of wildlife every day: foxes, polar bears, walruses, owls, ravens, terns. They saw some seals, not too many, but they hoped they'd return with the arrival of the ice. And one kind of surprising part of this story is the men didn't really know how to use guns. They didn't know much about them. Fred was the only one with any real experience, and he was not a great shot, as they quickly found out. And Ada was absolutely terrified of guns. She wouldn't even go near them. On the first day of hunting, the men grabbed some guns, hoping to get a walrus that settled nearby. As the huge beast snapped, it was oblivious to their presence, and so they took a few shots at it. And the first shot went too far to the right, the second one way too high, and the third way too low. It quickly became clear that they all needed to work on their aim, but after a week of arriving, they got their first polar bear. They saved the skin and cached most of the meat, bringing some back for the dogs. Bear sightings were so common some days that they'd see them in every direction, which I'm sure terrified Ada even more. 2 weeks after arriving, the men noticed a change in Ada. She started crying a lot, and her weeping became uncontrollable. Homesick and desperate to see her son, she just seemed to be unraveling. The men tried to be gentle and understanding with her, and Lorne wrote in his diary that she seemed like a child, not a woman of 23. But he said, "We'll watch her and take care of her." But then she began to behave even more strangely. Ada became increasingly obsessed with Alan. It soon became clear to everyone that she was infatuated with him. He was disturbed by the attention she was giving him, but the others loved teasing him about it. And one day Ada decided she loved Alan and wasn't afraid to let everyone know. Some days she would work and others she did nothing. She couldn't concentrate, and she became paranoid that the men, particularly Lorne, wanted to kill her. One day, Ada just disappeared. Alan and Lorne went looking for her and followed her tracks in the snow for an hour. They finally found her lying in a heap on the ground, and when they approached, she jumped up and ran away from them. They chased after her and demanded to know why she ran away. Ada told them that she just wanted to die, and she drank some liniment to poison herself. Concerned for her mental state, the men decided to separate her from Alan, building another camp a little ways away. It was also a way to keep everyone else apart, just in case boredom, disagreements, or violence set in those long, dark nights. Alan and Fred moved to the new camp, while Ada stayed with Milton and Lorne in the main camp. Ada sobbed when Alan left, and she kept sneaking off to their camp to see him. One night, Lorne got so frustrated with her that he tied her to the flagpole until she promised to get back to work. They tried kindness and understanding, and that didn't work, so Lorne felt he had to be more stern with her. And no one wanted her on the expedition anymore. They thought hiring her was now a big mistake. But Ada was just homesick and terrified. The men thought she was suffering from a condition at the time called Arctic hysteria, which develops in people trapped in cold places with endless darkness. Victims often frighten easily and sometimes commit suicide. Then they can return to normal as if nothing happened. As December rolled around, the weather was horrible and kept everyone confined to camp for weeks on end. The icy winds howled outside and the snow piled high against the tents, creating this world of endless white and freezing temperatures. Milton kept busy making deerskin pants, Fred did a lot of reading, and Alan kept adding to his scientific journal. And surprisingly, Ada started feeling better. The change in her was instantaneous. She got back to work with renewed vigor. She was sewing, washing dishes, and scrubbing clothes and scraping skins. At the same time, she gave up on her future with Alan, and the men were really happy about that, and happy that she was back to work. They even said that now she was working harder than everyone else. One night, while the men were out hunting and checking traps, Ada was alone at camp. The cold seeped into the tent, and the silence was broken only by the crackling of the fire and wind outside. Suddenly, she heard this huge footsteps right outside the tent, accompanied by sniffing, snorting, and heavy breathing. Terrified, she knew it was a polar bear. She hid in the corner, trying not to make a sound, convinced that any noise would lead the bear right to her, and she would be eaten alive. The fire eventually burnt out, and the temperature plummeted inside the tent. Ada remained motionless for hours, her heart pounding in her chest. After what felt like an eternity, she finally heard footsteps approaching the camp. Milton arrived and immediately spotted the bear, and with steady hands, the youngest member of the crew shot it dead. Rushing inside, he found Ada huddled in the dark, her face etched with terror. By early 1922, the men all decided it would be more efficient to live together again. Consolidating camps meant conserving wood and reducing the workload for the dogs. A few nights later, Fred lifted the flap on the door to go look for something in the shed, and he came face to face with an enormous polar bear, its eyes gleaming with this predatory hunger. Instinctively, he screamed at it and ran to the back of the tent, panic surging through his body, and they had all left their rifles outside the tent. And the bear began to push its way into the tent. They were defenseless and desperate as they grabbed anything they could find to throw at the bear, but it remained undeterred and kept coming in. As the bear came closer and closer, they picked up bits of wood and lit it in the fire, and then hurled burning logs at the giant beast. This finally worked and drove the bear away, retreating into the dark. After months of darkness, the sun finally peeked out over the horizon in late January. However, it brought no warmth, just more blizzards and more long days confined to camp. The howling winds and biting cold made every moment outside a struggle. Inside, Milton and Ada formed a close bond. She loved his company. His cheerfulness and thoughtfulness brightened her days. He shared funny stories about his family and home in Texas, which made Ada laugh and forget her own homesickness and fears. She thought he was brilliant because he knew multiple languages. And Milton, in turn, he asked Ada to teach him her language, and he was fascinated by the stories she shared, tales that were passed down from her grandmother. Then temperatures dropped to almost -50, forcing them all to huddle close to the stove for warmth throughout the night. Vic the cat was still doing well and thriving in this environment, actually. On the warmer days, she was exploring camp and playfully tormenting the dogs. But at night when it got really cold and the stove went out, she'd curl up with one of the men or Ada. Spring arrived with the melting snow in late March. The gradual thaw brought a sense of relief and renewal. The expectation of the relief ship arriving in a few months lifted everyone's spirits. Despite the harsh winter, the crew felt a sense of accomplishment for having endured and even thrived in such a brutal environment. They were tired and eager to see new faces and stock up with fresh supplies. As the walls of their winter house began to melt, they set up a summer camp. June and July passed in a mix of anticipation and excitement for that relief ship. By now, the men had grown fond of Ada and admitted they'd actually miss her when she returned on the ship. However, the joy of the coming spring was tempered by their struggle to secure enough meat. Lorne was getting frustrated with their situation, which he felt would be much better if they had proper equipment and knowledge. Despite the tension, he was excited to see Stephenson again, hearing news of the outside world and receiving letters from family. They had no idea that the rescue ship may not be coming. At the same time, Stephenson was down south, frantically looking for funding. By mid-June, he had no relief ship lined up at all. The government refused to provide funds, and the families of the men were constantly writing to him for updates. He managed to locate a schooner called the Teddy Bear, captained by an old acquaintance of his. Even though he didn't have any money, Stephenson made a deal with him, and the ship set sail for Wrangel Island on August 20th, 1922. It carried all the correspondence from the men's families and a fresh team of people and dogs. But conditions were unusually bad that year. Many ships reported that they were locked in ice all over the Arctic. Back on the island, the men in Ada were constantly monitoring the horizon for the ice and the ship. They were encouraged and excited when the ice completely disappeared on July 28th. And they were eating well enough, but their supplies were dwindling fast. As August arrived, the men managed to hunt many seals. Soon the seals became difficult to reach if they only had an umiak. And then the bears vanished. They tried to remain optimistic, watching the horizon every day for any sign of a ship. And they were all tired, physically and mentally worn out from a year of hardship on the island. Fred was tired all the time and had a wrenched back. Milton's lower jaw ached from an ulcer. And Lorne noticed soreness in his feet and stiffness in his joints, spending several days in bed. On August 28th, Alan gathered everyone together, including Vic, and they took the one and only group photo. And Milton held the cat in his lap. The ice conditions were the worst anyone had seen in over 25 years. The teddy bear followed the edge of the ice pack, but the ship was not strong enough to withstand the pressure. The propeller was twisted by the crushing ice, and eventually all the crew saw was a solid wall of ice in front of them. Sadly, they had to retreat and head back to Alaska. The captain was upset, knowing the families of the men were very worried. Stephenson, however, reassured everyone that the men were totally fine and all would be well until next summer when another ship would get there. By mid-September, everyone on Wrangel Island realized there would be no ship that year. They were crushed, realizing they'd have to endure another winter with no new supplies. It was not going to be easy. They'd have to really ration their dwindling supplies, and they faced the daunting task of finding a new campsite since they exhausted the wood supply near their camp. Alan and Lorne began seriously contemplating the daunting idea of making the trek across the ice to Siberia next spring. They estimated it would be about 250 kilometers or 150 miles. Once on shore, they'd have to trek another 800 kilometers or 500 miles to the nearest wireless station. The enormity of that task weighed heavily on them, but they knew they had little choice. They only had 5 dogs left in fair shape and a sled, their only means of transportation. Lorne was not well, though he tried to convince himself that it was rheumatism rather than the dreaded scurvy he'd suffered from before. The memory of that ordeal haunted him. Every bone had ached and his teeth were so loose he could have plucked them out easily. Back then, Stephenson told him to eat fresh meat or fruit and vegetables immediately to cure the scurvy. But the cure for Lorne ended up being 8 fat caribou tongues. 4 days later, he felt as good as new, but the fear of reliving that pain lingered. And he knew deep down the scurvy had returned, but he didn't tell anyone. In late November, they moved to the new camp just days before the sun disappeared till spring. Their groceries were now gone, and they were forced to rely solely on the food they could hunt. Each meal was a battle against the elements, the icy wind cutting through their layers of clothing as they hunted. They knew they needed to do something about their food situation, and they couldn't wait until spring. Their new plan was to depart at the coldest time of year in mid-January of 1923. They hoped to reach Siberia before the supplies ran out on the island. At the same time down south, Lorne's father was anxious for news about his son and kept writing to Stephenson. He'd written numerous times asking about the health and well-being of the men. Stephenson's response carried an air of false confidence. He told Lorne's father that it's a very healthful climate. The danger of illness is less than it would be in a city. They're in no more danger than they would be on an equally isolated tropical island. His words seemed to dismiss the harsh reality that the men were facing every day. He said about the only drawback is the absence of medical care. This understatement was staggering given the dire circumstances. He also said the most serious trouble they would face is loneliness. If they do get lonesome, they may come across to the Siberian mainland in February or March. With their skill, they should make that journey safely in 4 or 5 days. A ridiculously short and inaccurate time frame given the distance and conditions. What a bonehead. But it gets better. He then said, things such as appendicitis can be dealt with easily by a knife. What? All right, so Lorne's diary reveals the meticulous planning involved in preparing for the trek to Nome. The success of their journey hinged on several critical factors: the condition of the dogs, the availability of dog food, the weather, and the ice conditions. Allen wrote a letter to Stephenson explaining their decision to head to Siberia. He detailed their reasons and said that he left Fred in charge and that game was scarce on the island. So the men loaded up the sled and the dogs and they took off. But the journey quickly turned bad. The sled was overloaded for the weakened dogs and it kept tipping over, and each time the men had to painstakingly reload all the supplies into the sled. The cold was biting through their clothing as they struggled, and then they encountered this massive pressure ridge which they could not climb over. The cold seeped into their bones and Allen froze his fingertips. The pain was excruciating. Exhausted and disheartened, they camped out and weighed their options. Lorne finally admitted he had scurvy. It was a heavy confession to make. 2 weeks into the trek, beaten and exhausted, the men returned to camp. They needed to reevaluate their strategy. Back at camp, it was decided that the remaining 3 men should go on the trek, hoping that the 3 of them could better help the dogs. Lorne and Ada would remain behind. Now, Fred was not happy with this plan. He was aware of the dangers and his minimal experience traveling over the sea ice, and he was the most experienced. The other 2 had 0 experience. Milton was reluctant and unhappy about leaving, but didn't feel that he could argue. And on January 29th, Allen, Fred, and Milton left. Ada was terrified of being alone with Lorne. He still frightened her. And he wasn't happy being alone with her either, but had no choice. Lorne and Ada rationed themselves to 6 pieces of hard bread a day until the seals and birds returned. Their survival depended on the fresh meat that Lorne could secure. He knew Ada would be of no help, and he worried about relying on her if he grew sicker. The day after the men left, this vicious wind set in. Lorne worried about the men's safety. The wind gust could split the ice and crack it as suddenly as an earthquake, and the fresh snowfall could cover the sea, obscuring the safe paths. It would make it very hard to read the ice. One day, while chopping wood, Lorne passed out. Ada found him lying limp on the ground and thought he was dead. But he was still breathing, so she dragged him back to the tent and told him to rest. And after that, his condition worsened, and he confided in her that he was now scared. They had an encyclopedia there that Lorne looked at for scurvy symptoms and confirmed it. He had loose teeth, spongy gums, discolored spots on his body, and severe pain that intensified at night. The encyclopedia said that the cure was fresh vegetables and lime or lemon juice, but that was unattainable to him. Desperate for a bear to wander in camp, he was sure that fresh meat would help. So Ada took on all the camp chores. She checked the traps, but was terrified of running into a polar bear. And she only carried a snow knife since she was still scared of the guns. One day she caught her first fox and was ecstatic to bring back fresh meat for Lorne, who had been bedridden for weeks. Lorne later tried teaching her to shoot, but the fear was too much. She couldn't even get near the gun. Frustration started to build between them. He called her lazy, stupid, and thoughtless, even though she was doing all the work, and she would snap back at him, and they'd have days of silence where they didn't talk. And then all of a sudden, something shifted deep within Ada. She began to embrace her inner hunter. The survival instincts of her ancestors, the stories of strength and resilience passed down through generations, stirred in her. Determination replaced fear, and she ventured out into the icy wilderness, heart pounding, her breath visible in the frigid air. The first time she caught a fox, her heart soared with a newfound sense of empowerment. She had learned to move quietly, using the terrain to her advantage. Her senses heightened. She crept closer, each step calculated and deliberate. Ada would sneak close to the curious fox and then lunge at them and smash him in the head with a stick. She moved quickly, then grabbing it and breaking its neck with her bare hands, a primal skill she never imagined herself possessing. Her success filled her with a profound sense of accomplishment. Day after day, Ada honed her skills, her confidence growing with each successful hunt. She began bringing home foxes regularly, and she learned to read the land and anticipate the movements of her prey. Despite her success, the extra meat didn't seem to help Lorne. By now, he could barely eat. Ada looked out in the vast expanse, looking for a dog team and the men's return, holding on to Milton's promise that they'd come back. She started her own journal, documenting their struggles and Lorne's decline. By April, he had become despondent and increasingly angry. He lashed out at Ada, cruelly blaming her for her children's deaths and berating her endlessly. Ada was terrified of him dying and leaving her alone. In late April, Ada made a decision. She was going to live. And from that moment on, she focused on keeping herself alive and taking care of Lorne. As May arrived, birds and ducks returned, and the island started teeming with life once again. Summoning her courage, Ada picked up a gun and practiced her aim. She set up targets and practiced daily, improving quickly. One day, she watched as a seagull flew overhead and raised the gun without hesitation and shot it down. Lorne, who had been mocking her aim for months, was proven wrong because she was now becoming a bit of a badass. Determined to secure more food and watch out for bears, Ada built a platform above the house so she could climb up and keep watch. When the walrus returned, Ada knew that one walrus would feed them for a long time. But they were really difficult to kill. They were massive beasts, and the ice was always unstable where they were, and they were ferocious. So she decided to build a skin boat, something she'd never done before, but she had watched men in her village make them when she was young. That would give her a better access to seals and walruses. Day after day, Ada worked tirelessly on the boat, and it slowly started to take shape. Lorne's condition worsened, his bodily functions were failing, and Ada feared that he might die any minute. She kept working, though, and learning from her mistakes and growing stronger and stronger every day. As June arrived, Lorne was just skin and bones. Even then, he still had the energy to tell her that she wasn't skinning hides right. And she said she was doing it the way that her people did it, not the way white people did it. She told him that she was going to do it her way and that she was now in charge and was going to do whatever she wanted. Way to go, Ada. And she was bringing home lots of food, ducks, fresh eggs, and geese. It was quite the variety of food. But Lorne was fading fast, and he knew that his time was coming. He told Ada what to do with his papers and diary and other belongings when he died. He knew he would spend eternity on this island. Stephenson was once again in a desperate scramble, trying to secure funding for a rescue ship. It was like Groundhog Day with this guy. It was already June of 1923, and the Arctic summer was slipping away. He had officially ended his career as an explorer, but the unfinished business on the island bothered him, plus all those people that were suffering up there. So Stephenson turned to Harold Noyce, an explorer that he had worked with before. Now, Harold wasn't the most stellar of figures either. He was in financial dire straits, and he was never a successful explorer, but thought this opportunity was one that he could cash in on. It was a very dramatic moment in polar history. He could rescue these people and then take that experience to the lecture circuit and maybe even write a book or two. Meanwhile, back on the island, Ada became adept at killing seals, crawling on the ice and sneaking up on them and then using her boat to secure them. On June 22nd, Lorne died. Ada knew she had done her best and it wasn't her fault. Before he died, Lorne told her to be strong and fight for her life, to hang on until the rescue ship arrived. Despite his cruelty at times, she missed him. Their harsh circumstances had forged a unique friendship and mutual reliance. August rolled around and Ada focused on preparing for the upcoming winter. She had a lot to do and didn't want to get her hopes up about a ship arriving. The air got cooler and the nights grew longer. Each task she undertook was filled with a mix of determination and the gnawing fear of another winter alone. And on the night of August 20th, Ada dreamt of a ship. Her sleep was restless, filled with visions of rescue. When she awoke, the world was cloaked in this thick fog. But she heard a strange rumbling sound in the distance, and she assumed it was a walrus, so she went back to her tasty dinner of oil and dried duck. But the sound persisted, and then it got louder. Ada scrambled up to her platform, clutching her field glasses, but the fog obscured everything and she couldn't see a thing. She looked around, all around her, 360 degrees. Where was the sound coming from and what was it? And then the fog slowly began to lift, and her breath caught in her throat when she saw the mast of a ship piercing through the haze. Adrenaline surged through her and she ran to the ground, beach, her feet splashing in the icy cold water. She was not going to let this chance slip away. She was going to swim to the ship if she had to. She expected to see Milton, Fred, and Alan disembark, but when a stranger approached, she was confused. Harold approached and took in her shocking appearance. She had the look of a serious hunter, he said, dressed in furs from head to toe, a snow shirt worn over reindeer parka trimmed with wolf fur. Her face was lined and dirty, toughened by the brutal cold and hardship. "Where are Milton, Alan, and Fred?" she asked, her voice trembling. Harold was taken aback by her question. He expected to find all the men here. Gently, he told her that it was just him and he had received no word from the others. Ada's eyes filled with tears, her strength finally giving way. And she collapsed, the weight of this 2-year ordeal crashing down on her. Harold knelt beside her, reassuring her that her ordeal was over and that she was now safe. They went back to camp and they buried Lorne before they left. As they sailed back to Nome, Ada took one long last look at the island. The wind whipped her face and she said, "I'm never going to see that island again." It was an island of death and disaster. The shaman was right. Over the years, there were occasional sightings of the men in the high Arctic, sparking fleeting hope in the hearts of the families that the missing men may still be out there. But each sighting faded in disappointment and nothing ever materialized. Alan's parents were devastated. Their grief morphed into anger and they directed their blame squarely on Stephenson. In a heartfelt letter to a newspaper, they expressed their anguish. It was the shortage of food that led to their cruel and unnecessary sacrifice. Meanwhile, Stephenson attempted to sway public opinion, insisting that the deaths were a tragic accident and not a result of starvation or anything that he had to do with. But the men's own words disputed this. Milton's correspondence made it clear that he'd been exploited by Stephenson. He was naive and full of youthful optimism and just unaware of the dangers that lay ahead. Fred's parents were heartbroken and less vocal in their outrage. Milton's parents were devastated as well and blamed Stephenson, but Fred and Lorne's parents weren't as hard on him, maybe because their sons were a little bit more experienced and knew what they were getting into. Ada reunited with her son Bennett and her family in Nome. Life after this was not easy for Ada. She was hounded by the press and blamed for Lorne's death by people who didn't know the full story. Life was a mix of hardship and moments of happiness. She got married a couple more times and had another son, Billy, a few years after her return from Wrangel Island. Harold had taken Ada and Lorne's diaries. He even tore out pages of Lorne's and scratched some of the stuff out, and he refused to give them to Stephenson or the families for years. When Stephenson finally got his hands on them, he kept them for his own profit and wrote a book about them. Ada asked for her diary back for years and eventually got it, but received no money from him. She ended up spending a considerable amount of time with Lorne's family, who grew to love her for taking care of their son in his final days. Ada eventually moved back to Alaska. Her beloved son Bennett died in 1975 at the age of 58, a loss that weighed heavily on her. Ada passed away in 1983 at the age of 85. Despite her incredible survival story and the bravery that she displayed, she died unknown to the world as an Arctic hero. Determined that his mother's memory not be forgotten, her son Billy spoke passionately about her. He said, "I consider my mother to be one of the most loving mothers in the world and one of the greatest heroines in the history of Arctic exploration. She survived all odds. It's a wonderful story that should not be lost. A mother fighting to survive, to live, so she could carry on with her son." A month after her death, the Alaska legislature officially recognized Ada's heroism with a citation. It described this recognition as a small token of remembrance for a woman whose bravery and heroic deeds have gone unnoticed for many years. Billy had a large rectangular plaque mounted on his mother's grave, and it simply read, "Heroine, Wrangel Island Expedition, 1921 to 1923.